So, the biggest mistakes on the biggest missed opportunities. This has been a fun one to research because, honestly, and I'm recording this before I do the live because of what I have coming up over the weekend, there is some really weird stuff when you start looking into this all. There is some really, really, really weird stuff. And by weird, I mean the choices chosen, the options selected, and the people involved. And you have to start looking through going, hang on, what is this mistake due to? Because the trouble is, there is so much other stuff which happens in the 1920s and 30s. And there's also the London Naval Treaties, which have their own series of interesting concurrent effects. Honestly, you could argue quite honestly that the... I used honestly twice there, didn't I? The biggest mistake of the Washington Naval Treaty is the London Naval Treaty, but we'll leave that to one side. That is the biggest mistake for everyone, and, well, it's a problem. You could also argue that the biggest mistake and missed opportunities is the lack of investment in infrastructure that goes on. But honestly, the treaties do not stop you investing in infrastructure. You could invest and grow your infrastructure even if you don't have the fleet requiring it. You could just be sensible and go, right then, so treaties are going to limit me to X, but I do, as part of the treaties, have escalator clauses, and therefore I shall build the infrastructure to accommodate the escalator clauses, and it should the treaty system break down. It's sort of a case of going, well, I want to be able to rapidly mobilize up to this figure. And that's not the treaty which stops you. The treaty does not stop you doing that. That's your own desire not to spend money which is stopping you doing that. In fact, realistically, quite a lot of the bigger mistakes that are made in the 20s and 30s are made for a desire not to spend money. They are politicians and some admirals wishing to get the maximum ego value for minimum cost. Not necessarily the maximum bang for the buck, the maximum ego value for the cost. And there are some decisions in here which are not going to be a surprise to people. The fact is, there are going to be some in here who've heard me talk in this channel are going to go, oh, well, you're talking about that again. Well, yes, but I've talked about it in several other contexts, and now it's putting it all together. It was really interesting when I was putting together different countries and thinking about who the signatories were, what they were involved in, the treaty limitations, and comparing it. And there was a quite interesting concurrence because some of the signatory countries, or countries which were signed on behalf of, they have basically the same mistakes and the same missed opportunities. But they are the same things they're missing out, but the reason they're a missed opportunity, or the reason they're a mistake, is for different reasons. It's different factors every single time, but it's the same scenario that they're missing out on. And that really did interest me, because I was working through and going, the first couple of drafts of the slides when I was working on this, I thought, it can't be this, it can't be that. I can't keep coming up with the same answers. And I went back and forwards through the information. Backwards, forwards, the whole way through it. Should have said back and forth, didn't I? Should have done. Backwards and forwards through it. And no matter how I added up, it came to the same results, just by different ways. And I found that rather intriguing. But I was looking at it, of course, through the metric of the treaty system. So therefore, there is an overriding assumptions which come from the treaties, which divide into those categories, which could therefore give you lots of different roads leading to that particular Rome. Destroyers. Strange enough, they come close. I love them, and it would have been a great thing for me to write to be able to spend this whole video talking about destroyers. But actually, everyone's building destroyers. Honestly, whilst they would have probably grown slightly larger, the differential between what they'd have been and what they wouldn't have been without the treaty system, especially as the Washington Treaty doesn't place any limitations on them other than they can't be more than 10,000 tons. So you could realistically have built, destroyers. And you could have built as many as you liked up until 1930, until the London Naval Treaty. You could have built them as heavy as you like. You could have started off a standard of, these are our destroyers, they're 3,000 tons. And then by the time you get to the Washington and London Naval Treaty, they'd have had to recognise an upper limit for destroyers of 3,000 tons. You could have done that. There is no limit on you at all. So therefore, the fact that destroyers aren't being built, that's not a mistake of the treaty, is it? It's just not. Destroyers aren't being built mostly because the navies have a massive glut of them post World War One, and therefore they go, well, we can take a bit of a holiday while we work out what next generation destroyers are going to look like. Really test this lot, factor in war experience, and develop some tech. Which makes sense. Does make sense. And there's a Spreadshirt store as well, which has all sorts of interesting things down below. And I'm pointing this out because, please note, family birthday season is coming up. Okay, there are 3 things which drain my bank balance on a regular basis. Me noticing some really nice vintage naval history books are for sale is number 1. Number 2 is me buying pictures for the books which I'm putting together. That licensing is expensive, as I've been through before. And 3, Christmas and birthdays. I have a lot of them. In that, I have a lot of family. I love them dearly. And even if you set it as a £10 limit, there is a lot of them. And there are about, goodness knows how many birthdays in September. There is a reason why the first 2 weeks of September I have just locked out as going, I'm going to put it handled as if I'm away, because I am going all over the country for various birthday parties. Yeah. I'll be back home, and then I'll be off, and then I'll be back home, and driving all sorts of places in day trips or a couple of days, and then back home. It's going to be fun. But there are a lot of birthdays. So I will point out the Spreadshirt as well. So, the criteria. It has to be mostly attributable to the treaties, not the 10-year rule, not the economic downturn, the Washington Naval Treaty. So I'm going to give you some examples, and you might notice there's the lovely Taylor Swift there, who is the absolute darling of my little cousins, and quite a few of the older cousins. And I've, honestly, of the concerts over the years, I have had to take cousins to, and been taken to, hers have certainly been more entertaining than most. And not quite so disturbing as some of the boy band concerts they have taken me to. We'll leave that to one side. And this is an American Airlines flight. Now, missed opportunity. I would say not taking my cousins to a Taylor Swift concert. When I missed it. It's a missed opportunity, because it's a chance to spend some time with the family, and it's a chance to I don't know, bond, but also find out how they're doing their lives and have a bit of fun. It's a nice thing to spend time with your family, and that's a missed opportunity. Mistake. Few years ago, before COVID, my dad was going to do some consultancy work in America, and I was busy, so I didn't go. But he offered to take me with him because he was going to be near the battle in New Jersey, USS New Jersey, and so we'd have gone around New Jersey together. But no, I was very busy at the time, and I said, well, you'll probably be going again, because he was down to go again in a few years' time. And it was a year later he was gone. And it would have been 2 years later, actually, when COVID hit, that we would have gone together, and I was going to have the free time. And I was very busy with work and all those things, but I will look back on that as a mistake. So basically, a missed opportunity is something you could have done, it would have been fun, but not doing it is not necessarily a detriment. It's not, my life is not massively made worse by not having gone to the Swift concert. I can take or leave the concert. It's the time with the cousins, which I enjoy. And there are other times I can get with the cousins. And I've already done a couple of those concerts over the years. I'll do another one next time. Next time she comes on tour in the UK, I'll take them then. But that's the sort of thing. I can do that. But I can't get back. And I didn't realise at the time it was a mistake. You don't realise it's a mistake necessarily until you put it in context later. And that's especially true in the treaty system. Because I'm going to be looking at some mistakes, and some of them it's with hindsight. You knew it wasn't necessarily the correct decision at the time. You knew it wasn't. But you were making a judgment call at the time. Later on, it turns out to be a mistake. So, no. And that's the answer to the question of people when they ask me if I've ever been around Battleship New Jersey. No, I haven't. I'd like to someday. I haven't actually had much experience going around American historical ships. It's one of those things I've really got to actually go and spend some more time on. I've managed to have quick trips, but really there are some of them, like their aircraft carriers in New Jersey, etc., where really you need to be able to spend 2 to 3 days wandering around the ship because they're so big. To learn all their history, you need to be able to sort of sit there and spend 2 to 3 days wandering around. Now, one of the interesting questions that comes up usually is Empire submarines. Well, it was perfectly possible to build up a far larger submarine fleet after the Washington Naval Treaty. There is no limitation, again, on the number of submarines you can construct. But at the time, submarine technology had sort of peaked. If you look at it, submarine technology does sort of like that. It's not a... And to be fair, the technology in the 1920s was probably not what you would really want. But building up a submarine fleet in the 1920s to justify having more submarines, especially on the London Naval Treaty, would have been a good idea. Having, I don't know, Australia, India, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand all have submarine units, squadrons of submarines. Australia has some for a while. If they'd all built up significant flotillas of submarines, let's see, say 18 to 30 subs each. Even if they were coastal submarines, they would have provided a significant protection and deterrence. i.e., the sheer number of submarines you could have had operating out of Singapore very quickly in World War II, in 1941. The British could have had a deterrence force of submarines around that area, which would have made landings in Malaya far more fun, and then fun for the Japanese to contemplate, and the whole thing far more difficult for them to maneuver. Submarines are a very useful aerial denial weapon. However, what did the British concentrate on instead? They concentrated on mine-laying capabilities. And that's where you find the real mistakes and missed opportunities start to creep in. So whilst Empire submarines are, I would argue, a missed opportunity of the Washington Naval Treaty. They could have built them, but they didn't. And there are legitimate arguments for and against on both sides. People can say the technology is not mature enough yet. They can say population base, government costs, government spending, all those sort of things. But honestly, submarines at this time are not like today. It's one of the... I was talking to somebody on there and they're going, but the submarines are so expensive. They're billions of pounds. And I was going, the submarines in the 1920s were not billions of pounds or the equivalent figure of billions of pounds. Not by a long way. Why? They weren't nuclear powered for starters. Why not? And that was left a whole interesting conversation with someone who had apparently reached the age of 25 without realizing that submarines could be diesel powered and not have a nuclear reactor. Or rather, could be diesel electric. Which also led to a serious question from one of their colleagues at one point as to whether or not they were kidding when they said, so Tesla were around in the 20s to design batteries for submarines? And one of their colleagues honestly looked at them and went, please tell me you're kidding us. They weren't. They weren't. Please note, Tesla... There are lots of companies who've been designing batteries for a long time. And the batteries on submarines in the 1920s and 30s were not lithium-ion batteries. But leaving that to one side, please, there is a history of technology. I know it doesn't... I know we're all busy people and we all have... things which take up our day, but for all its faults, and there are many, including the fact that you don't know who authored and who edited it, Wikipedia is an okay starting point, as long as you read the sources down below, at the bottom. And if you have no more knowledge than that, you at least shouldn't interrupt yourself too much. Anyway, Canada. And you are going to notice a theme very shortly amongst certain nations. So, mistake. This is the sloops, the Benton-Egret class in 1934. They could have been built before then. They could have been building sloops in the 1920s. There's no limitation, again, on vessels under 10,000 tons in the treaty system. But even under the London Treaty, they could have built them as well. Why is this a mistake to not do this? Well, there's three reasons. One, it would have built up your infrastructure. And that would be useful for Canada. Two, it would require less investment in terms of crew and personnel than building up a larger ship formation. And those vessels can be used for mine laying, mine sweeping, anti-submarine warfare, convoy escort. All sorts of things they can be used for. Oceanography work. There are lots of different ways those little vessels can be useful. So keeping up a constant churn of them is actually a viable way for investing in your own industry, your own navy, and your own country. But it does factor into the same scenario as the missed opportunity of the county-class cruisers. Now, the whole idea the British had for the counties was to build a sort of empire cruiser. The idea being that all the nations in the empire, all the dominions, actually have some. Now, this would have been a massive advantage in World War II. It would have probably changed the structure of the London Naval Treaty, because especially if you end up with 40 to 48ers some sources have them as wishing to have across the empire in the by 1930. You were starting off with basically 480,000 tons. Add in the Hawkins class, and you've probably got some region of an argument for 550,000 tons of heavy cruiser. You've got a matched level of light cruisers. Well, that could be 110 cruisers of 10,000 tons. In other words, across the empire. And remember, you always have to remember that it's the British Empire navies. It's not the British Navy, it's the British Empire navies. It's the Royal Navies are treated as one under this treaty system. So, if you don't take advantage of the Washington Treaty and its ability to build whatever you can, the moment the London Treaty comes in, you are fudged. You are quite simply encased in a lovely tasting mixture, but ultimately it will make you sick if you eat too much of it. And if it doesn't make you sick, it'll certainly make you fat. And goodness me, I love it, but I know how many hours it takes me on the treadmill to deal with it. So, wrong way. For Canada, why? Yeah, we joked the Canadian government doesn't want to invest in defence, and we talked about the various treaty limits, etc., and they don't want to invest. But honestly, investing in the Royal Canadian Navy would have been one of the more sensible things they can do. This is a nation which depends upon maritime transport for communication at this time, and movement of goods, especially around the lakes, but all internally, but also externally. And depends on its sea lines of communication for its commerce and trade. And it's also a thing of if you want to if you want to be part of the club and you're prepared to pay in, also being able to pay the minimal. This is why this is the mistake and that's the missed opportunity. That would have been great. But getting them to pay for cruisers, that's going to be a whole different government. But getting them to build up a force of sloops and destroyers maybe, but mainly sloops, to protect their commerce and do some trade protection duties and all the other stuff that comes with it. That could have been useful. And they could have even given them sort of icebreaker hulls, or really icebreaker bows. And then they'd have been a really useful system to have wandering around Canada in the 20s, in the 30s. And the good thing about both sloops and cruisers, this one's able to be upgraded because of its size and space. This one's able to be upgraded because it is so frigating simple. You just go bonk, bonk, put in. And you can go, oh, well, what about Aztec? The fact is, the Royal Navy in 1930s, late 1930s, is upgrading even World War I vintage sloops. Flower class sloops of World War I get one or two of them, I think it's two actually, get upgraded with Aztec. They test it out on them, they upgrade them. So if they can do that with a World War I emergency build sloop, I'm fairly sure anything which would have been built in the 1920s and 30s to less than 2,000 tons could have been built very easily. Italy. Well, the mistake is going to be very easy for you all to realise, because this is a favourite thing for me to basically be upset with the Italians over. The Francisco Caracola class. I think at least the Francisco Caracola, which is launched, this is a picture of her being launched, should have been completed. I think they should have demanded the right to complete one new battleship. One of their new battleships, because even if they'd taken their time, it would have been such a useful ship to have, such an upgrade. They'd have been ahead of the curve in the Mediterranean, and it would have been a tremendous boost up. They could also got rid of one of the older, less capable vessels. There's also the fact it's 34,000 tons fully loaded, so I have no doubt at all, it is well underneath the standard tonnage limitation of required at the Washington Naval Treaty. So it's a mistake. They didn't push for it. They didn't demand the right to complete the Francisco Caracola. I think it would have strengthened their fleet immeasurably in the 20s and 30s, and I think it would have been a major advantage even in World War II. Because if you consider the Littorios, etc., you would have had that as your baseline to build up and design and spec your Littorios from, not the previous vessels. And imagine how good the Littorios would have been if they'd been spec'd up from the Francisco Caracola. They're still good ships. Don't get me wrong. If I have to pick between a German battleship or the Littorios, I will pick the Littorios every day of the week. Because they are far, far better designs in terms of efficiency and in terms of their scalability. But they would have been so much better. Now, missed opportunities. The fact is, they didn't build an aircraft carrier. They had the option. They could build an aircraft carrier at any time. They didn't even have a burn. They could have taken one of the Caracola's sisters and converted it into an aircraft carrier if they wanted. That would have been really interesting and cool. Why didn't they have it? Well, you can argue, did they need one in terms of the med training, etc., and with their arguments to the Air Force, etc.? You can argue all that. But I think, honestly, it's a missed opportunity. I think it would have been something interesting for them to have. I think it would have been a capability that would have been useful, and I think it would have honestly had a lot of ripple effects. But, okay. Now, please note, I'm not using the phrase not developing proper ASDIC or sonar for their Article 8 compliant escorts and building them in numbers. They build these lovely speakers. But the trouble is, despite the Sapphire 600, which is their system, being installed and tested on the Albatross, which was, well, can't remember which class it was, but it was one of the sub-chasers built by the Ranger Marina, one of the smaller vessels. And them having these excellent vessels, this is a speaker class, that were very much able to be built within the treaty limitations and built as many as they could. The sonar was the same sonar which was going to be fitted to their submarine. It was, well, built in the same factory and built using the same components that was going to submarines. And the Italians don't build that many submarines, but they take up all the sonars that are available. So the thing is, they have built a sonar, but they built a sonar that's not easy enough to build, that they can build in the quantity they need, and is not, therefore, going on enough things. So they had the ability to both build this and the capability and knowledge, but they don't. I would say either of these things would have been a very interesting thing for the Italians to have pursued. I also think that an Italian aircraft carrier would have been numero uno target for the Royal Navy's U-class based in Malta. I think the 10th Flotilla would have been hunting that thing from, well, from pillar to pillar of the Mediterranean. Anyway, South Africa sits astride the Cape of Good Hope. It literally has global sea lines of communications wrapping around it. It is a key point, therefore, for global trade, for British Empire trade. And yet, it doesn't develop the tools it needs to protect itself and protect that trade, and therefore to be able to really take advantage of that trade in terms of diplomacy. Because if you are able to protect that trade going around your area, you suddenly become a very important nation. Now, having county-class cruisers, etc., would have meant that, honestly, something like the Graf Spee would probably have considered the whole transit between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean past South Africa to be a very misguided idea. After all, that's going to be right in whatever South African vessels existed backyard. And there could be a couple wandering around going, "Hello, we'd like to introduce you to our 8-inch guns." However, again, it's one of those things of South Africa, if they're going to introduce these things, it would have caused them to have to either over-recruit from the very small population they were often prepared to recruit from in technical roles, or to widen the recruitment. And the trouble is with a navy is everyone's serving alongside each other. And it very quickly can become an issue. In that people can work out very quickly how smart anyone involved is. A navy is a complicated thing. Navies, as a rule, are not good spaces for apartheid. You can try, and in small ships to an extent that have very short range, you can maintain it. But in larger ships, which could go sailing around the world, and would exchange crew and personnel with maybe the wider Royal Navy, you might well find yourself with an issue. So yes, there are cultural reasons beyond their own view of we're away from, no one is near us, no one would come for us. If anyone comes for us, they've got to come a long way and come past the Royal Navy, so we don't need a navy. However, again, the sea lines of communication coming in. Having the ability to support their area. Having the ability to also be a part of the wider force structure of empire. They had this. This was it was a mistake. They could have done it under the Washington Treaty. They could have done it under the London Treaties. They could have built some sloops, and that would have helped them. It would have changed their scenario. Because, honestly, South Africa in World War II was horrendously exposed. I mean, the entire reason, really, the British have to do what they have to do with Madagascar is because if they don't, and the Japanese pull a similar stunt as they pulled in Vietnam on a Vichy territory, there is nothing to defend South Africa. And nothing to defend the African territories. And South African is the key component of those African territories. So, I'm sorry. That is because South Africa hasn't been paying in as part of the Empire defense. This is another thing which comes up with Empire, and people often go, yes, the British, that it's been terrible, their recession Empire. Well, the Empire costs a lot to defend as well. And protect, and you have to pay a lot of the bills and a lot of the premium. And you can argue whether or not it was worth it at certain points. You can honestly make the case that by the 1950s, it wasn't. It wasn't worth the expense. Because even within the limited expectations upon some of the dominions in terms of their defense, they weren't pulling their weight. Some were, most were. And please note, this is nothing to do about their, I'll say this with South African, their bravery in battle when they send troops off, etc., is absolutely first class, okay? Their quality of their personnel when they deploy them is excellent. They are really, really good, really loyal soldiers. And really loyal service people. But their governments don't invest. This is not a critique of the country. This is not a critique of the People, this is a critique of the governments and decisions they made in the 1920s and 30s. Just before I get anyone sitting there below going, oh, you don't like this country or that country. No, it was the governments, okay? And critiquing governments is a good thing. It's, if you don't critique them, how are they going to learn? Now, France. The question that should be asked with France is who hurt them, okay? So, the whole problem for them is actually being part of the treaty. The mistake is not any of the ships. You can point to the burn, you can point to all this, they're all massive mistakes, but the mistake is actually being part of the treaty. Or rather, being limited to the same size as Italy. This for them is a massive issue, because being the same size as Italy means, well, quite simply, it means that they are trapped. They can't defend their empire and defend themselves in the Mediterranean. Italy's their competitor, and they've linked themselves directly to that. And the thing is, they're not even... They've probably looked at it and gone, well, Britain's done the same with America. But A, the Anglo-American relationship is very different to the Franco-Italian one. B, the British are gambling on Congress being tightwads and not paying, not footing the bill to pay for enough ships. And guess what? Their gamble pays off. The US Congress do not pay for enough ships. So, whilst on treaty, Britain and America are equal, in practice, Britain always has the larger navy, by a large distance, because of Congress. In the 20s and 30s. Okay? So, again, before anyone starts going, you're being, America is good. America's fine. The US Navy are great. It's Congress not being prepared to pay. Which means that whilst treaty officially America and Britain are supposed to be equal, in reality, British government are prepared to pay for the Navy. So the Royal Navy's like here, and the US Navy's like here. Everyone else is still distantly behind them, so it doesn't really matter. But that's the scenario you're dealing with. It's just... It's the history. France agreeing to being the same as Italy, when Italy does not have the same strategic situation, and as France, and actually shares a border with them, is a far bigger problem. Yes, you can argue that the British agreeing to the Americans is the same, because the Americans have to be strong, realistically, in two oceans, if they are worried about the Atlantic, but mostly because they're not worried, because the Atlantic, Britain's the other side of it, and anyone who really wants to mess with America is probably going to want to mess with Britain first, and the Royal Navy is pretty darn big, so they'll have to deal with them before they get to America. So you've got time to move your fleet around. So you can concentrate your fleet in the Pacific. So, you've got that advantage. And Japan just has to concentrate on the Pacific. Doesn't even have any competition with the Atlantic. Whereas the Royal Navy has to think about the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. Thanks to the Empire. So yeah, you can argue that. But the trouble is, for the Italians, it's pretty much the Mediterranean. And thanks to some later adventures, the Indian Ocean a bit. But for the French, they have pretty much the same commitments as the Royal Navy. Now, this is where you start off with going, okay, well, what's the problem, Alex? Under the Washington system, they could build as many cruisers as they liked. Yes, they could. Under the Washington system, you can build as many cruisers as you like. They just have limited to 10,000 tons maximum. So why is France not churning out cruisers to protect their empire? By the way, I have the same problem with Britain and every other country. Why, when you are not limited in tonnage, are you not building a sufficient number of vessels? And if you think about it, if you ordered 4 counties a year, if the British had done that from 1922 onwards, the British would have had 32 counties probably in service or in construction at the time of the London Naval Treaty. At least. If they just ordered 4. And 4 counties are not going to break the British Bank in any way, shape or form. If you want, we can I can go through the. If anyone would like to, I will quite happily put pictures of the British Historical Statistics book I have up here from R.R. Mitchell, B.R. Mitchell of Cambridge University. So if you want to, this is a great book to have, and you can get stats books like this for most countries, and you read through them, and you soon learn the truth about their spending and what they're spending their money on. And then you look at the cost of things, and you look at it, it's a very minor amount of money could be shifted around. And you would have a lot of advantages built in. Now the thing is, if you were building those cruisers, if you were building those ships, that's going to peter into employment, because whilst trickle-down economics, there's a lovely theory of many people in terms of, if we make the rich lower their taxes, they spend more money. Actually, people, yes, to an extent, they tend to invest their money, but how they invest their money is up to them, and so you can't guarantee that investment is going to be in your own country. However, if you invest in defense spending and the infrastructure before it, you can guarantee that is going to be in your own country, and that will trickle through to the economy. Yeah, all the defense and tech you work on, it's going to trickle through. It's going to be a factor. So, it's something to think about. That not doing this, that by having these treaties and deciding not to spend that money, to not do that work, you've actually, to an extent, undermined your own economy. Because you're not investing the same amount of money. If you consider, again, for Britain, any money spent in shipyards, building warships, especially when they do with the town class cruisers, or the counties, etc., and they picked the yards to an extent, because all the yards are fairly good, to an extent on which yards would have a biggest impact on which areas which were suffering the most from job shortages, has an impact, a ripple through on your economy. It employs people, and that employment, that money goes into the economy, and it pays people's wages, but also they don't invest their wages in other things. They buy food. It circles through. And you can consider it, but you can also consider the ripple effects of all that spending and that money being spent multiple times by multiple people, and all the employment that generates versus how much you're paying in things like a job seekers allowance and those sort of scenarios. India. Again, missed opportunity. It's the county class cruisers. Why is it a missed opportunity for India? Well, honestly, for India, they could have built them. There's all sorts of debates over them. Having cruisers for India, similar scenario to South Africa, but also a scenario is that India actually has yards which could conceivably have built their own county class cruisers. So they could have built up their own infrastructure. They could have built their own counties, which would have been a massive investment in their own infrastructure, in their own capabilities. It would also been cruisers like that, etc. They become a melting pot for a population. You cannot get away from each other. You want to establish yourself in the world. You want to grow yourself. You want to become independent. Having a cruiser wandering around the world kind of screams you're independent already. And the fact that the British were prepared for India to have a squadron and were happy to support them in growing a squadron really shows the British were quite keen on the idea of India going independent at some point. Not too distant away. Because that squadron would have been a very big capability. Now, the mistake again is going to be the sloops. Because again, they could have been used to build up their own infrastructure. They could have been used to build up. And the thing is, India builds some because of this very reason. They build some sloops. Not Bitten class, they go for an earlier class, but they build some because they need that capability. They should have built more. They could have built more. Sloops are very, very cheap. We are talking modern OPV prices. And I'm not talking about the expensive Dutch equivalents. I'm talking about the cheapest chips versions that most nations like Britain has wandering around the world. I.e., the river class. They're actually, probably adjusted for inflation, actually cheaper than that. So, it's a mistake to not make that investment. It's a mistake not to grow your country. It's a mistake not to have that capability there, because here is the biggest thing, though, with the sloops, and this is why they are in the mistake, not the missed opportunity category, because I honestly thought, I'll spin this around for India, because India will be different. But then I was looking at it and looking at their reliance upon movement of goods by sea to move food around their country. We've talked about this. There are various issues in World War II. We usually talk about one of the famines, more than the others, but there are other issues as well moving goods, because India has developed its infrastructure in a large part to move goods not around India, but to move goods to the coast of India, and then they move them around by sea. It worked fine, as long as there were no other threats. The moment there are threats, they don't have the ships. They don't have the ability to escort their own ships, which means they lose a lot of ships. And then once lost them, where are the replacements coming from when they've got the Battle Atlantic and all the other operations going on around the world? So if the Indians had built up their own force of sloops, their own capability, they'd have had patrols out there for surface raiders. And again, people go, well, surface raider could fight a sloop. It can fight a sloop. Probably can win. But usually, A, sloops do not move around solo. Usually there's 2 or 3 of them. And B, they will make radio noise, and then some big shipper, like this, a big lady shipper, will turn around and go, hello? Have you hurt my little friends? Or if you're really unlucky, HMS Renown comes along, because HMS Renown has a overwhelming mothering complex for all small vessels. And as Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would calmly tell you, we were strictly under orders not to engage capital ships, honestly. I always love that when people go, they were drawing away British capital ships. The only capital ship that was chasing them was Renown, which was pissed off, which was annoyed because they had sunk one of her destroyers. Japan. Okay, so the Amagi was damaged by an earthquake, and yes, there are limited options available, but under no circumstances should someone have turned around to the cargo and gone, you will make a good carrier. By this point, everyone knew when they were doing this that carriers needed to be fast for the airflow over the deck. Not they need to be fast for operations, not they need to be fast for all the other things, they need to be fast for the airflow over the deck. So, why anyone in their right mind considered the cargo, I do not know. I know there are limited options, and you can quite rightly turn around and go, but Alex, what else could they pick? Well, they could have gone to the treaty system and gone, we haven't got anything else to pick, can we build a new carrier, instead of going for another conversion. They could have done that. You can argue then they'd be limited to less weight, but you can build a more efficient hull and a more efficient ship if you build it from scratch than if you use a conversion. We haven't got a suitable conversion, we need to build a new carrier. That's a mistake. But missed opportunity? Well, if you are going to build cruisers like the Megamis, which are designed to be upgraded from 6 to 8 inch guns, that means you're already functioning for quite a long time on the idea of making your ships able to be upgradable, changeable for what you want them in a war role. You need to do that more. And you can do that on the treaty system. One of the really interesting things was I did think about Japan and submarines, because Japan could really hide their submarine construction in a way that others couldn't. Honestly, if you think about the scenario of Britain, America, and all the other places with their the amount of people wandering through and by their yards, it's very hard for them to hide their submarine construction. Same for Italy, Germany, all those countries. It's very hard for them to hide their submarine construction because they're far more easy for people to wander around. Whereas Japan, it's far easier for them to limit people wandering around. And when you consider they are an island, the other side of the world from most of the other powers involved in this, at least the other side of an ocean, and if you consider submarines usually only have numbers visible, and numbers can be changed around all the time if you really want to be fun, but they can be moving between yards, and you can keep them constantly moving. You can build some yards which have covered space, etc. All sorts of ways to hide submarine numbers, while still being discreet. You know, you have a warehouse next to your dock. The fact that the entire part of it is just got a concrete bridge rather than a concrete wall, and they can just float in underneath it, pop up, and be served maintenance. You can do all sorts of things and get away with it in this time period. If you're prepared to cheat properly. This is a missed opportunity for them. Everyone else is cheating as well, and let's be honest, people like to say no one cheats. They all do. They all treat the treaty in their own way. Sometimes it's they obey the law but not the spirit, and sometimes they completely ignore the law and the spirit. But the British are good ones by the way, for making the wording of the treaty specifically designed so they can get away with it. They don't break the law, but they do absolutely dance on the grave of the spirit. So I'm not saying Britain is innocent. By the way, America has their own issues. I have got into that in the past with the various issues that they cheat on the treaties. There's a whole Washington Treaties video on this channel. They're all fun. Everyone does it. No one is innocent. Possibly the French. But no, they're not innocent either. Then we have New Zealand. Well, again, it's much the same. But why is it a problem for New Zealand? Well, they are an absolutely massively exposed island. They have a very small population. They do not want to provide ground forces to any Empire defence. And the Empire defence of the Far East, they know, is going to be a Navy-led formation. They actually do build up some cruisers. They actually do end up with a cruiser squadron by World War II, which is turned into the Royal New Zealand Navy. And that's a wonderful thing, but that's 20 years later than it could have been. And one of the other interesting things when people start talking about this, going, well, how are they going to recruit the people? The Guides Axe hits in the UK. Okay? The Guides Axe is coming. No matter what happens, the ambassador's brother is going to inflict his axe. And when I say ambassador's brother, of course, when I was talking about the representation sent to Washington, the signatory representation. Not the full delegates, signatory representation. The British ambassador is the brother of the Lord of the Admiralty, who of course decides to cut a lot of people from the Royal Navy. Well, if New Zealand, and to an extent mainly New Zealand, had been actually taking up the position of building the cruisers, then the Guides Axe, when it fell, could have been structured in such a way of, well, would you like to come work for the New Zealand Navy? Would you like to come work for the New Zealand Navy? And a lot of them could have been hired into the New Zealand Navy, all these things, and that would be an emigration bonus. A whole load of people coming out with their experience, their families, their skills. And then we've got, again, the sloops. And the thing about the sloops is, when you talk about Australia, when you talk about New Zealand, when you talk about any of these countries, they could have built them domestically. The cruise is slightly more difficult. Australia could, to an extent, probably have built one or two domestically. India certainly could have. Canada, if they'd wanted to invest enough, could have done, but who knows. South Africa, it's unlikely. The sheer amount of infrastructure they need to build to actually be built one is something of that size. But they could have built sloops. They could all have built sloops. And again, it's the sea lines of communication. And when you're looking back on World War II, think about this. If in 1923, all these nations started a policy of building 2 sloops a year, so you've got 5 dominions. And let's say Britain also matches that bill by building 10 a year. They replace some old ships with them, but they also keep up a certain number. So that's 20 being built a year. By 1939, if you start in 1922, considering how long they take to build, which is roughly a year to 18 months, in terms of from laying down to commissioning, you would have launched somewhere in the region of 340 ships. If you have only kept half of those in service, you've kept building them, but you've kept half of them in service, and the other half have either been paid off into reserve, or they maybe been sold and converted to merchant ships, you could still have 170 vessels. $85 with the Royal Navy, 85 with the 5 dominions. You also think about the infrastructure they'd have developed. You think about the construction capabilities they'd have developed, which would mean in World War II they could rapidly spool up to churn out other things. Because if those sloops use the same turbines as destroyers use, the only difference is they don't carry torpedoes, then it's not that difficult to turn to destroyer construction. It's not that difficult to surge other capabilities. And at that point, you do there is no need for any crash building of flowers or anything like that. So you can use all those resources for finishing off other things. America. Both the mistake and the missed opportunity. Cruisers. They laid down the Pensacola class in 1926 and 27. Salt Lake City is commissioned by 1929, having been laid down in 1927. So a little over 2 years. Pensacola is a little over 3. They're laying them down in 1926 and 1927. The US Navy has had, under the Washington Treaty, they've been limited to cruisers under 10,000 tons. They could have built as many as they needed in that time period. Yes, you can argue, well, you know, why are we building them? What are we building them for? Well, what do you want them for? If you're going to claim to be a first-rate navy around the world, and you want to be the world's one of the 2 top navies in the world, you need to have presence around the world. And if you can't build capital ships, cruisers are how you do it. They are your presence ships around the world. We don't want to be the world's policeman. Okay, that's fine. But a big shortage for the US Navy is having enough cruisers. A big issue they're always facing is having enough cruisers. It would have helped them grow the size of the Navy more sustainably. It would help them grow their infrastructure. It would have helped them grow their design bureau and test things out. It would have helped them in terms of their war performance and war capabilities, because I swear some of the reasons why they are being quite so conservative with how they're handling their ships, you know, they're not zigzagging or doing the things you would think at night, is because they've had so few of them for so long. They are being very, very precious. One of the interesting stories that goes around about the US Navy at the beginning of World War II is that they fire all their submarine commanders and they promote the XOs. Because the story goes, it was because the submarine commanders were so used to being told, don't risk the boat because the boat's precious. and so handled the things so conservatively, so gingerly, so carefully. They weren't doing what they needed. They weren't aggressive enough. I have to say, I think the story's twaddle, but we'll leave that to one side. I never really bothered with it, because I just don't rate it. But I will say that the US Navy has a lot of problems at the beginning of World War II for them in 1941-42, with commanders who have their assets have always been so precious, so precious, that they don't know how to handle them in terms of what risks they should take. Now, I'm not going to say the Royal Navy is immune to this. They're really not. But there's a reason why for both navies, and for a lot of the other navies, and you can tell navies which don't have the large destroyer arms, the officers who end up becoming senior very quickly tend to come from the destroyer section of the Navy. And you ask the question, why? Because the destroyer commanders were allowed to bash their ships up. They regularly took risks. They were encouraged to be massively aggressive. And they did. And so the destroyer commanders learn what is necessary, a necessary risk, and what is a not unnecessary risk early on. And this is part of their fundamental belief and understanding. If your cruiser is a very, very critical asset, and there is literally a handful of them in your navy, you don't risk it unless you absolutely have to, especially not in peacetime. And a commander who has that mindset, a captain who has that mindset of fearing to risk their vessel, doesn't make the best decisions in war, because sometimes the safest option is the risky option. Because let's be honest, proceeding in a straight line and a line ahead so everyone can fix on everyone's lights is the safer option for night transit, because you all know where each other are, and the thing you are sure of as a risk is bashing into each other and therefore damaging your ships. But the trouble is, the unknown threats you don't know, and the risk you don't know is maybe there's submarines with torpedoes, maybe there's Japanese have a very long range torpedo. All these things are options, but even if you're not thinking about a massively long range torpedo, if you honestly believe there is no such thing, submarines. Do your cruisers have sonar? Nope. Do they have hydrophones to hear for torpedoes? Nope. Why, in the name of all things holy, are you not zigzagging then? Because do you know where the submarines are? No. But that's an unknown risk. And you're banking on, there won't be submarines here. And therefore the known risk that I'm accounting for, and by keeping everyone in a straight line, is the risk of them bashing into each other. It's a mindset. And it's not something which these people need to be critiqued for. It's not something you can sit there and go, they're bad commander because of that. No. It's because their entire career, where there have been cruisers, they are such precious assets, they have been taught to treat them incredibly carefully. It is not the fault of the individual then, although you would hope they would recognise it themselves, but it's not the fault of the individual. It's the fault of the system they are in, that they have grown up like that. That's how they've matured as a commander in that scenario. Another missed opportunity. The Lexington class battle cruiser carrier versus the Colorado class. This is one where I get in trouble, but this is why I put it as a missed opportunity. It's not a mistake. It's not a mistake. The Colorados are very good battleships. They really are. And the Lexingtons are battle cruiser. 2 words. Remember, I talk about this in other videos on my channel if you haven't seen it. The original Phraseology, of course, was a dreadnought armored cruiser, but that quickly becomes a battle cruiser, 2 words, and that means the vessel is designed to use battleship grade guns to do the cruiser role and go around the world doing the cruiser role and basically being able to beat up every other cruiser as well. So, battle cruiser, it's for the scout, it's for the cruiser role, but it has battleship grade guns and form. Then there's battle cruiser hyphen or 1 word, which tends to be a vessel which is designed to go and fight battle cruisers. And then you move along sort of. So if you say the battle cruiser, 2 words, is here, then the battle cruiser hyphen or 1 word is about here, and then the fast battleship is here. That's the battleship role, but it's prioritizing speed enough that it's going to accept slightly less quality armor. And then you've got the battleship, which is going to prioritize being as close to the center of the armor, firepower, speed triangle as possible. Now, for the US Navy, having the Colorados gives them a very, very strong battle line. But they already have a strong battle line. It gives them 2 more 16-inch gun ships. So would 2 Lexingtons. It gives them the status of these battleships. But the thing is, they have a lot of battleships. What they don't have is battle cruisers. What they do not have is the speed and the deployability of battle cruisers. Now, battle cruisers offer you 2 advantages. One, there's the carrier battle cruiser combo, the task force, which with a pair of Lexingtons, probably, I'm not sure whether it would have been Lexington still and Saratoga, or it would have been 2 of the other vessels which would have been selected if they did decide to do that. And Lexington and Saratoga complete as battle cruisers. But if they had been, they would have been very powerful combination forces. That would have given you a fighting core and capability which would have really strengthened the scouting force. And the thing is, as good as the battleships, the Colorado class, are, you are immediately stripping the heart out of your scouting force plans. And so you strengthen your battle fleet, but you weaken your scouting fleet, which was supposed to be the reaction fleet, the rapid movement force for the US Navy. I don't see it as a mistake, because either one has fors and againsts on the options for going for one and going for the other. And the US Navy made the choice it did, and the Colorados were good ships. But I think a modernized Lexington class, and let's be honest, they would have been modernized battle cruisers. They would have been some of the first ships probably to be modernized in the late 1930s, early 1940s, probably late 1930s. They'd been some of the first to be modernized. Could have been a really interesting vessel for the US Navy to have in World War II. And the thing is, they wouldn't have been in battleship row. They'd have been out the carriers. They would have been out with the carriers. And then, interesting enough, there are options, especially considering their own in-belt range, etc., where they become very useful ships in certain actions. They might divide the fire aimed at the carriers. They might provide extra support for the carriers. But also, they might provide extra confidence, and they would provide extra confidence for the carriers when doing daring operations. High-risk operations when you've got a fast capital ship escort which can keep up with you. And that ship's job, it knows it's not probably going to win a fight against an enemy battleship or anything like that, but it can hold them up long enough, hopefully, for the rest of the force to get away. That's its job. If you consider HMS Renown when she's with in a task force with HMS Ark Royal in the Mediterranean, Force H, wandering around, Italian battleships get close enough. She immediately pulls away from Ark Royal. They're still trying to get away at high speed, but Renown drops back. I don't think there was an engagement that day. I think they did manage that they manoeuvred away so that it wasn't a fight. But it's quite simple. Renown knew her job. And that's an enabler for a carrier strike. That's an enabler for a strike carrier and movement of your carrier forces. I think it would have been really interesting if they had. I think it's something to think about as a missed opportunity. Not a mistake, but a missed opportunity. Australia. Well, they did actually get 2 Carney-class cruisers. So why is it a missed opportunity? Well, they could have got a couple more. They could have got them. They could have tried to build them themselves. The big mistake are the slopes. And yes, the Australians built the Bathurst class, and they are lovely vessels. I love them. I was wandering around one. It's beautiful. But, and I want this to be noted, the Australians should have been building them earlier as a way to boost their infrastructure. They did actually even have a plan to do that, and then the government cuts it to save money. They have a plan to order lots of ships in various yards to build their infrastructure, and they cut it to save money. And then the yards go bankrupt, and they have to deal with not having that infrastructure when World War II turns up, but also having to deal with a lot of unemployed people in the meantime. And not having the ships that they would have had. And you can say, well, they saved money. They did. But did they save money? They saved pennies. They cost themselves pounds. And the thing is, a constant building program under the Washington Treaty, through the London Treaty, of those ships. Even if you're just ordering 2 a year, would have made a colossal difference to the Australian Navy, to the sea line communication, to the security of Australia as a nation, to World War II. I think it's hard to argue that the changes, especially the cutting of that construction program, was anything but a mistake. It's hard to argue that. It really is. And so we have our last country. Britain. Well, they only ordered 3 Britain class, so that's a mistake one. Britain is really worst of everything because, again, they are building sloops the entire time for basically from the late 20s onwards. They're building a class of sloops every year to test out what they need for anti-submarine warfare. They just don't order frigating enough. They could have ordered a couple of dozen sloops in 1934. They could have ordered a couple of dozen sloops in 1928. They could have ordered a couple of dozen every blooming year, and it would not have come anywhere near the budget for what they spent on other things. Even within the Navy, let alone within the nation. And again, think of the opportunities and the abilities it gives you if you do have that force, if you do build up that capability. Think of what you have, what you've enabled yourself to do. I would argue that the counties are also big. They should have built them, but it's not as big a missed opportunity as this. It's rather like the American Lexington class scenario. You see, nail rods are not a bad choice. They have a massive amount of armor. They are massively powerful ships. It's very hard to argue against ships which were so useful as Nelson Rodney in World War II to argue that they are a mistake. But you then look at the F3s. Their speed was to be 28 plus knots. They were to be armed with 9 guns again. They were going to have slightly less armor because they really were fast battleships. More in that their area of coverage was closer to a battleship, but they had 10 inches of armor rather than 14 inches of armor. So they were technically produced under the battle cruiser heading. But the most important part of this opportunity, and I suppose you could have applied this to the nail rods either, as well, is they were going to be armed with 15-inch 50s. Now, I have a debate sometimes with people because there is also a 15-inch 48 wandering around, mentioned in some sources, so it could have been a 15-inch 48 rather than a 15-inch 50. But let's say, for simple things, because 2 out of the 5 books I mentioned have said 15-inch 50s, 2 have said 15-inch guns, and 1 said a 15-inch 48. Let's go with 15-inch 50s. So, if you have 15-inch 50s, you can upgrade. It's not going to be easy. In the treaties, it's interesting in terms of viability, but you're not changing the not changing the gun. You're changing the caliber of the gun in terms of its length, or how many cals it has. You're not changing the actual gun though itself. It's still a 15-inch gun. So if you'd gone with the F3s, you'd have ended up with 2 very interesting fast battleships, which would have come in at roughly 34,000 tons. So they still have 1,000 tons underneath the treaty limit in standard, and still would have had water as armor and various other things, but they would have been interesting. You would have had those as your capabilities. 2 more fast ships, 28 knots. That's probably going to mean that when you're modernizing your Queen Elizabeth class, you might well decide to modernize some of them up to 28 knot ships, which you could do with small troop boilers. So that's going to give you a lot more faster ships going into World War II, which is useful, because it means you have less strain on Renown, Repulse and Hood, but also you have more adaptive options in terms of that, because, well, these could also be involved in doing the rapid fast movements. So you could have seen one of them could well have been deployed with, I don't know, King George V, or even one of them might have been with Hood and Prince of Wales. That's an interesting thing to think about. Now, the other advantage here is if the 15-inch 50s are available, you're going to start upgrading ships to the 15-inch 50. First one's probably going to get upgraded is Hood. It's the easiest one to upgrade. It's got the most space. Renown, Repulse. Oh yeah, you can upgrade those again. Space. And Queen Elizabeth class. Even the R's might get upgraded in all over the period of the 20s and the 30s. So instead of the 15-inch 42, you could have the 15-inch 50 as your gun. That's a capability difference. As an opportunity, it's second to none. It's also King George V's when it comes around to it going, well, we've got 15-inch guns on every single of our ships. Why are we getting 14-inch? They might also end up with 9 15-inch 50s. It changes so much if you start off with the F3s. People always focus on just oh, well, their armor is weaker than nail rods, so that's automatically going to make them not as good. Well, they're going to be used differently. But honestly, armor you can upgrade. You can slap on more armor, and honestly, they could have slapped on 1,000 tons more armor, and that would have been fine for their stand displacement, and probably not affected their speed that much. And 1,000 tons more armor? Well, probably gets them up to about... Could well get them up to the 14 inches of the Nelson and Rodney in the key areas. So they could have a belt of thickness of 14 inches over engineering spaces and magazines, 10 inches over other areas. Would work for me. It would be a very capable vessel. But more importantly is that gun, that 15-inch 50. And it's a missed opportunity because and it's down to the treaties, because when they're looking at the treaty they're going, battleship. So even though they've got this excellent idea on paper and they're sitting there going, that fits our doctrine, that fits our suspicions for modern war, of future warfare more, this is what fits the treaty requirements more, the treaty outline more. So we build this because make our politicians happy. But this, the F3, that would have been a potent tool to have. It wouldn't have had the 16-inch guns, but it would, more than likely, 15-inch 50s, firing green boy shells. Yeah, that would have been a capability and a half. And I think that would have changed things going into World War II. I think that could have changed things looking at the treaty system again, because, again, if you're Germany and you're building your ships, okay, knowing you have to face Renown, Repulse, and Hood is one thing. Knowing you could face Renown, Repulse, Hood, and let's say Nelson and Rodney, but they're F3s, and they all got 50-inch 50 cals, that's going to change your gun construction. That's going to change a lot of your ideas. You might be able to hang in a fight with Renown and Repulse if you're Scharnhorst and Eisenhower. But the odds of 15-inch 50s against Hood, Nelson and Rodney, all capable of 28 plus knots, you're going to have to be going very fast to get away from them. Which is going to, again, raise the cost of your construction. And deterrence is, to an extent, as much about image in your opponent's head as anything else. This is another picture from the Washington Naval Treaty, and it's one of the interesting pictures to put up because you have an idea of all the delegations, all the people looking on. All the various people at the sides of the discussions and all round, people watching it, people involved in these big table sessions, and the people who are the signatories sitting at the table. There were a lot of interesting ideas included in this treaty. There is a lot of earnest intent behind this treaty. There is also a lot of failure in this treaty. The missed opportunities are many. I have picked out the ones I consider the greatest. The mistakes are several, and again, I have picked out the ones which I consider the greatest. And I'm sure some people who watch this video, especially people who don't watch this whole way through, are going to be sitting there commenting below, going, "Dear, you've missed out the wrong one, there's this one, this one." Yeah, fine. I accept all that. So, I've got 3 questions for you. Question 1. If you just watched the video and you just enjoyed it, there's a thing on my channel which I've started people doing, which, well, I've started asking people to do, because people were just putting comments in for the logger room and all those things. I went, well, can you just write Bravo Zulu? Because that's a nice naval phrase for well done, but also it's something interesting, and it shows me if you've watched the whole way to the end of the video as well when you comment. And that's, I like that. I like to know if someone's watched the whole, that's going to sound strange again, but it's minor, especially recorded videos, the whole lecture, the whole lesson, the whole seminar, for the lives, etc. Secondly, I'd really love to hear your opinions on the things I've suggested in terms of what are mistakes and what are the opportunities. I'd love to hear what you think about them. Especially the Lexington class battlecruiser one, because I know I make that point a lot. And I know there's a lot of discussion about that, and I would say it's the same with the F3s to an extent, and they're major power things. In that, it's the differences they're going. It's not necessarily one is better than the other. It's the different capability mix that having X will give you over having Y, and I think it would be very interesting, which is why I've marked them as a missed opportunity, not a mistake. And finally, I'd love to hear what you think are your own missed opportunities versus mistakes. But remember that definition, the definition I gave at the beginning, and I gave you an explanation to some extent. A missed opportunity is something you can correct. It will be nice to do, but ultimately, if you don't, it's fine. It works out. Option A is as good as option B. It's a missed opportunity when you think about it, but you were happy with option B. Taylor Swift concert. Mistake is something you can't undo. And the thing is, in some of those, I would say the reason why, for example, the county class cruisers are a missed opportunity and the sloops are a mistake, they're not doing them, it's because the sloops give you 70% of the capabilities which the cruisers would have given you, in terms of the investment in infrastructure and all those things, for a lot less cost. So doing one, not doing one, I can understand. Not doing the other, you are really undermining yourself. And thank you for watching. This video will come out on Saturday the 12th, when I could well be driving up to where I'm going to be running a revision centre for next week. So that's going to be Key Ships 4 coming out. There's going to be one of those videos is going to come out on... One of those videos will come out on Friday, on the 9th. On the 11th, I mean. And another one will be coming out on the 13th. Hope you enjoy it. And there'll be another one on the 14th, I think. I think it goes 13th, 14th, 16th, 18th, and 19th for the episode, the videos this week for Key Ship Series 4. And so next week, it's Building the Fleets of Mobile Bay, which I have just deleted the last recording I had of, so I'm going to have to do again before I go away. Fun times. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.